These last few moments have significantly added to the happiness that I have mentioned at Anne's arrival from upstate New York. Now, those of us who know people who once lived in Manhattan, we know that we talk about Ossining as upstate. But Anne really comes from the boondocks. And the fact that she's floated downstream down the Hudson is a wonderful thing. She's going to tell us about how she got to us. I want to mention only that Anne comes with a flock of academic degrees, a master's degree in German, a master's degree in business administration, a doctor of ministry, and the seal of approval from the American Ethical Union. She has been the leader of the Long Island Ethical Society and the New York Ethical Society. She is now emerita from the New York Society for Ethical Culture. But she merits a lot of welcome. So, Anne, thank you for coming.
You were right. I wasn't thinking while I unplugged the speaker.
Thank you. I always enjoy being here with you. You're just such a lovely society, and I always feel at home. You always make me feel at home. It's very cozy here. So thank you. I open with a poem, of course, because poetry for me is ethical culture, humanist liturgy. This one is called What is Divinity by Wallace Stevens. What is divinity if it can come only in silent shadows and in dreams? Shall she not find in comforts of the sun, in pungent fruit and bright green wings, or else in any balm or beauty of the earth, things to be cherished like the thought of heaven? Divinity must live within herself. Passions of rain or moods in falling snow, grievings and loneliness, or subdued elations when the forest blooms. Gusty emotions on wet roads on autumn nights, all pleasures and all pains, remembering the bough of summer and winter branch. These are the measures destined for her soul. Well, today is December 8th, and it is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. However, because this year it falls on a Sunday, the solemnity is transferred to the following Monday, a practice that even the city of New York honors, because tomorrow is exempt from an alternate side of the street parking regulations. That means that I or my chauffeur can park wherever we want when we return home. This feast was solemnized as a holy day of obligation on December 6, 1708, by the papal bull Commissii Nobis Divinitus of Pope Clement XI. And most missals of that period, missals meaning the prayer books that you have when you go to Mass, most missals of that period refer to it as the Feast of the Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary, focusing more on the action of her conception than on the theological question of her preservation from original sin. However, on December 8th, 1854, Pope Pius IX issued the Apostolic Constitution Infallibus Deus, meaning infallible. The Most Blessed Virgin Mary, in the first instant of her conception, by a singular grace and privilege granted by Almighty God, in view of the merits of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the human race, was prevented free from all stain of original sin. Hence, immaculate. Now, this may sound extremely esoteric, and indeed excessively nitpicking to you. But I can assure you that growing up Catholic, this was deemed very, very important. One of my earliest memories is waking up, climbing out of bed, and walking into the kitchen to find my grandmother sitting in the rocking chair waiting for me. I kneel in front of her, hands clasped in her lap, and recite my morning prayers. Our Father, Hail Mary, and a good act of contrition. Only then can I sit at the table and eat my breakfast of Cheerios soaked in milk and a glass of orange juice, because, as Graham always said, one must serve God before the devil. Got it? Ineffable and eternal, soul first, physical body second. And that's how Catholicism was taught in my family. Prayers were incantations, magical thinking abounded. The Baltimore Catechism was memorized and recited. If you're not familiar with the Baltimore Catechism, it starts off with, who made you? God made me. Why did he make you? To know, love, and serve him. And that, it goes on from there, but basically it's, we are creatures of God. We are created and made by God to know, love, and serve him. My mother grew up in an Irish Catholic tradition, which meant every priest and nun was infallible, Mass every Sunday and Holy Day, communion at Mass only if you went to confession the Saturday before. And I just a little riff here on that. One of the things my mother would do when I was an unruly and rebellious teenager, which meant I talked back to her, was we'd be sitting in the pew in time for communion, at the Mass. My mother would turn to me and she'd say, "You are not going to communion because you talked back to me." And so that was a sin that had to be confessed and absolved. And so I sat there with the rest of my family going up to communion. The goal was to embarrass me. Anyway, no meat on Fridays, and thank God for the gift of faith not to challenge any of the church's mysteries. My father converted Catholicism from Dutch Reformed, where the daily reading of the Bible was a tradition he continued until he died. The parish priest apparently enjoyed his conversations with Dad because they remained close friends. And after Vatican II and the Ecumenical Council, which took place between the years of 1962 and 65, with its thawing of hostility towards other religions, Dad and our parish priest participated in forming an interfaith food pantry in our town. Well, John the 23rd got to work updating the church soon after he was elected Pope in 1958. And the Ecumenical Council changed a lot for us, especially at Mass, where the altar was turned around so that the priest faced us, and he spoke in English, not in Latin. And my uncle, Father Tom, who was also my godfather, was a priest in the Rochester diocese. He was the first to introduce altar girls in his parish. I remember my aunt railing, she viciously mopped her kitchen floor, that we were becoming damned Protestants. It didn't end the magical thinking in the pews, nor the sexual abuse by clergy who were shunted from parish to parish around the world to escape accountability. But it did open the windows as well as the doors through which many priests and nuns left entirely. In college, I took a comparative religions course that pushed me further out that door, and I made Jewish friends, one of whom I married. I also worked at the campus interfaith house, befriending the chaplains there, and discovered Catholic activists like Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker in the Lower East Side, and the Berrigan brothers, who led many a peace march, as well as the worker priests of Latin America. And as I told the children earlier, I shared with them the book of the Joyful Mysteries of the Rosary. I then discovered Hans Küng, and he wrote Infallible and Inquiry. So the book that I shared was published the same year I was born, 1951. This was published in German in 1970. It was translated and published here in 71. So 20 years later, I'm able to say to my mother, whom I said believed every priest and nun was infallible, you know, Mom, in fact, popes are only infallible when they issue a specific encyclical, and even then, they're not infallible. I think Mom knew she had lost the battle at that point. That's kind of a framing, I think, those two books, a framing of my Catholicism. And most of you here know the story of my humanist because I've been here so many times. And so you know that Glenn and I were married at the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture, where we raised our two children, Andrew and Emily. Emily's carrying on the tradition. She works with the American Humanist Association, the Center for Education. And that's where, when it was previously the Humanist Institute. And that's where I had a lot of my training. Also, my training started with the American Ethical Union lay leadership training the summer of 1998. And that was when I decided that I began to think that I had a vocation. And of course, that word vocation goes back to my Catholic upbringing, because when we were training for communion and confirmation, whatever sacraments, we were seated in the pews for our training, the priest would almost rail at us. Do you have a vocation? You know, search your hearts. Do you have a vocation? And so the summer of 1998, with the lay leadership summer school, I realized that I did have a vocation, but not to become a Catholic nun, rather to become an ethical culture leader. So I learned at the Humanist Institute, and I later co-mentored classes there. It became the Center for Education at the AHA. And as Bob has said, I became the ethical culture leader at both the Long Island Society and the New York Society. And then I had these wonderful university chaplaincies at Adelphi in Garden City and at NYU and Columbia in New York. So that's kind of as by way of introduction, you know, that journey. But by way of theme, I want us all to be thinking about our own spiritual, philosophical journeys. What journey, what paths have we been on? When did we think we were maybe on a path and then we saw something go off this way, a divergent way, and we went down there, and then went down this way or that way? What did our parents teach us? What did we learn from them? What did we find ourselves unlearning about that? What do we grow up learning, and then what do we keep? What do we hold on to? What do we discard? What do we replace it with? Maybe how do we tinker with it a little bit? I'll hold on to this, but not that. There are cultural Catholics, right? Cafeteria Catholics, I'm sure in every denomination. You hold on to some piece of that culture, especially this time of year. How many people will go into a church with their score of Handel's Messiah and sing along? You know, how many of us will put up a Christmas tree? I've decorated the house. It's part of being a cultural Catholic that I carry that with me. Because as I told the children earlier, I was fortunate. I had a happy childhood at St. Anne's Roman Catholic. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed my friends, my family there. I didn't escape from it. I didn't run away from it. I grew away from the beliefs. I went through that open door. When John the 23rd said, you know, other religions have value as well. And when he looked into asking for forgiveness for sins of the church, that really resonated with me. I thought, this is a good guy, and I might stick around because of him, but no. What do we know that matters most to us and enough to hold on to? And what beliefs do we hold so dear that we share them with others, that we want to shout about them, maybe even proselytize because we love them so much? So let's compare now. And I want to sort of have you sit with that and think about the things that you're holding on to. Now I want to compare and contrast Catholicism and humanism. And yes, today we have in this country, we've had for a long time, but they have more, I guess, we hear from them more. We hear more from Christian nationalists. We hear more from right-wing Catholics. Growing up, I never knew about Opus Dei and the more right-wing Catholics. That wasn't part of my upbringing in a parish. Now I'm hearing that there's somebody who wants to be on the cabinet who loves the Crusades. Thought that was a good idea. So that kind of right-wing branch to the Catholic Church was unknown to me growing up, and I learned more about it as an adult. But if we were to look at sort of mainstream Catholicism, which really has become more liberal, and compare that to humanism, I think you'll find there's a lot of common ground. And I always emphasize the non-theistic aspect of ethical culture. I could no more join an atheist organization than I could a theist one. And not because I believe in a God, I don't, but because I think it's important that we allow for differences of opinion about the ineffable, about what the universe is. And I don't want to judge someone who finds comfort in a loving God. I don't want to judge someone who has lost a loved one and believes that they'll be with that loved one again in an afterlife that they call heaven. I do want to pay close attention to what's going on here. So it's not about a belief or a disbelief in deities or a life after death for me. It's about ethics. And there's a wonderful song that we have called an anthem now at the Brooklyn Society called Nothing More. And the refrain of it is, it's how we treat each other and nothing more. So I brought with you, as behind Bob, I'm leaving it with you, a poster from the American Humanist Association that has 10 commitments. So of course, many of us know about the 10 Commandments. And if you didn't grow up with them, you can go to a public school in Oklahoma, Florida, or Texas, and you'll see the 10 Commandments up on the wall. But in the AHA has sort of used that, I think, in a very clever way to talk about what are the values that we share in humanism. And so they refer to altruism, that I will help others without any reward for myself, that critical thinking is important, that I'll practice a good judgment by asking questions and thinking for myself. Another is empathy, that I'll consider others, right? When I think about empathy, I also think about the golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And what I like about ethical culture, love about it, is the reframing of that to act in ways to bring out the goodness in others and thereby myself. Right? That it's not, if I'm doing unto others as I have, I'm assuming that you're just like me and that whatever's good for me is good for you. But if I'm acting in ways to elicit the Susanness in you, and then I'm relating to you, I'm forging a relationship that's meaningful for both of us. And that's ethical, right? So empathy is an important part of it. Environmentalism, of course, we're not only stewards of a world that was created for us, but we're part of this environment. We're part of nature. And so not being stewards, but rather caring for it because we're part of it. Ethical development, always learning to be a better person, recognizing our mistakes and learning from them. A global awareness. I'm first thing this morning, I look at the headlines, I'm looking what's happening in Syria. Global awareness. What's happening around the world? I could have been born there and not here. A humility. I love that they've included in their 10 commitments, humility. Why? Because I think the AHA as an organization in its past, and some other organizations and some atheist groups are guilty of the sin of arrogance. So I really appreciate that in this reframing, they really lean into a kind of humility, that I'm aware of my strengths and weaknesses, and I appreciate those of others as well. And then peace and social justice, that's always been part of our platform. Responsibility, again, a crucial part of humanism and ethical culture is that I am responsible for my own behavior. I'm accountable for it. And then finally on this is service and participation, that given all of these commitments, I act on them and I serve and participate. So how does that resonate in Catholicism? Well, you know, it's interesting. There was a resurgent humanistic spirit of sorts that was kindled in the 11th century. And it came out of widespread rebellions against church abuses. You know, that often happens. What you told about being in the library, the art show, how are they coming together? Because anticipating that there will be some abuses, and how do we get together, you know, to fight against it? So kind of a resurging humanistic spirit in the 11th century in the church because of those abuses. And also during that period, monasteries became the centers of classical scholarship as they translated ancient and Roman texts. They kept that alive. These were the seeds of Catholic universities that would ultimately spread the elements of humanist education to a rapidly expanding middle class. So humanism owes something to the monasteries who kept those texts alive. And then as we entered the modern era, two sources of Catholic humanism were evident. The first I mentioned earlier was the Vatican itself. And it was seen as a compassionate edict of several popes. So even before my fave, John the 23rd, we really got into Pope Leo the 13th in 1891 was the first one who issued an encyclical about the condition of labor. And it was the first time it was expressed a humanistic concern in response to the abuses of the Industrial Revolution. So, you know, give credit where credit is due, you know, that in 1891, a Pope issued an encyclical, you know, infallible, about the abuses of labor. Then in 1931, Pope Pius XI, in another encyclical, commemorated that by reiterating the themes, including the dignity of labor and the rights of workers to organize. And following this, several popes issued additional encyclicals emphasizing the church's commitment to the humanist principles of social justice, human rights, and the dignity of labor. There are a number of organizations now that are that speak to humanist values. And there are 10 principles, just as there are 10 commitments of the AHA that they've articulated, 10 principles of Catholic social teaching. Respect for human dignity. Every person is worthy of respect, simply by virtue of being a human being. Number 2, respect for human life. The tradition sees the sacredness of human life. Now, we know how some of that gets interpreted, some of that gets implemented in terms of reproductive justice, although there's also Catholics for choice. So number 2, respect for human life. 3, association. We are our true selves when we relate well to others, not when we're isolated individuals. Number 4, participation. People have a right, indeed a duty, to participate in shaping a more just and humane society. 5, preferential option for the poor and vulnerable. The needs of the poor must take priority over the desires of the rich. Priority. The rights of workers over the maximization of profits. The preservation of the environment over uncontrolled industrial expansion. Number 6, solidarity. Learning to practice the virtue of solidarity means learning loving your neighbor has global dimensions in an interdependent world. Number 7, stewardship. It calls that environmentalism, but the church, Catholic Church stewardship. We have a responsibility to care for the world's goods, stewards and trustees, not primarily as consumers, but as part. So they try. Number 8, subsidiarity. Mispronouncing this. Subsidiarity. Clearly determining the right amount of government help or support that's needed to accomplish work. That's kind of an interesting interesting value, interesting social teaching they have there. Number 9, yes, subsidiarity, subsidiarity, determining the right amount of government help that's needed to support. Interesting, right? So they recognize you can get some, well, look, the church does get support, as do other religions. Interesting that they include that. Number 9, human equality. We talk of it in terms of people giving people a fair go. And finally, 10 is the common good. A community is genuinely healthy when people when people flourish. So there's a lot of resonance between those, I'd say, connection between those 10 principles of Catholic social teaching and the 10 commitments as articulated by the AHA. So there are some explicitly sort of non-traditional organizations within Catholicism. I mentioned Catholics for Choice, and that's the strive to be an expression of Catholicism lived by ordinary people. Specifically, they say we are part of the great majority of the faithful in the Catholic Church who disagrees with the dictates of the Vatican on matters related to sex, marriage, family life, and motherhood. So these are the people that we will align with on free choice, on reproductive justice. And so they really do focus on abortion and contraception, HIV and AIDS, sex and sexuality, and new reproductive health technologies. When I was sort of in between Catholicism and humanism, or like dual tracks, it was originally called Catholics for Free Choice. And I was an active member, although not an active Catholic. So now it's Catholics for Choice. The other active group now is called Call to Action, which is a leading organization focusing on challenging Catholics to act for justice and build inclusive communities. And among their core beliefs are that faith communities have the responsibility to foster inclusivity and justice, and also that every individual has the right to act according to an informed conscience, responsibility to promote the equality and dignity of all people. So Call to Action is another active Catholic group that, and again, they believe that they're speaking to the majority of Catholics by really extending that understanding of inclusivity. And then another one, just the last one I'll mention, is Catholics United. And that's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to promoting the message of justice and the common good, found at the heart of the Catholic social tradition. And they accomplish this mission through online advocacy and educational activities. And they started around 2004 with a group of activists coming out of the Catholic Voting Project. So those are some of the active groups now that are within the Catholic Church, and I think have some, we can compare them, I think, favorably, some aspects of humanism. Conclusion. I have a long conclusion. How do we make sense of our existence, and how do we forge meaningful relationships? The childhood friend with whom I've remained closest and with whom I have the most in common is a St. Joseph nun in the Rochester Diocese. Ann Alderman, SSJ, is now retired, but in the absence of priests in the rural areas of Western New York State, often fills a clergy role. She's a spiritual advisor to many, sometimes including me. Just a little anecdote to show you how much we have in common. She ran an interfaith retreat center in Western New York in the town of Dundee. It's nestled between the Finger Lakes of Keuka and Seneca, and a beautiful cobblestone house, and it was a retreat center. And a couple of summers ago, I gave a program there, humanist meditation. And so I was the guest there. I participated, and I also gave this workshop and led them in a humanist meditation. And Anne and I have found that we have more in common, myself as an ethical culture clergy leader, and she as a St. Joseph nun, than any of our childhood, middle school, high school friends. And we just find that connection with each other. So I'm going to share with you some excerpts, and I brought full copies of it if you're interested, of something that she wrote called Reflections on the Feminine in God. So this is from Ann Alderman. Regarding God as feminine brings to the fore aspects of the fullness of divinity that tend to be obscured when we refer to God in only masculine terms. If God is also feminine, then our Father would become our mother. What difference would that make? I imagine a mother close, familiar among us, not as some distant heaven, as we tend to perceive it. Today, kingdom is a word that conjures up a hierarchical rule. I do not perceive a mother as having that kind of kingdom. She would not desire to be the ruler of all. Rather, a mother would establish a home, a warm, welcoming, let your hair down, accepting, listening kind of place. A mother would give us what she knew was best for us, not necessarily everything we wanted, and maybe some things we definitely would not choose for ourselves, but we would receive it all from her, knowing she always had our best interests in mind. A mother's forgiveness would be waiting for us before we even knew that we needed it, much less asked for it. The hard part would be accepting the forgiveness when we knew we didn't deserve it. The temptation would be to think we could somehow earn it, or to go on punishing ourselves until we felt justified in accepting it. I do not believe a mother would be particularly interested in kingdom, power, or glory as our culture has come to regard them. The mother God I'm envisioning is the creator of all diversity, the origin of all life, who holds us all together in dynamic harmony and with whom we are all one. And so I offer this simple prayer, the Lord's Prayer, in a new key. Our Mother. Our Mother who is among us, holy be your name. Your home be realized. Your love be shared on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today what you know is our need, and help us to accept your forgiveness so that we may forgive those who act against us. Make us aware of your presence during times of trial, and protect us from missing your gifts, from misusing your gifts. For you are life and love and dynamic unity forever. Amen. That is from my dear friend, Ann Alderman. And for us, a closing poem that's humanist. It's from Anne Alexander Bingham, and she titles it, It Is Enough. It is enough to know that the atoms of my body will remain, to think of them rising through the roots of a great oak, to live in leaves, branches, twigs, perhaps to feed the crimson peony, the blue iris, the broccoli, or rest on water, freeze and thaw with the seasons. Some atoms might become a bit of fluff on the wing of a chickadee, to feel the breeze, know the support of air. And some might drift up and up into space, stardust returning from whence it came. It is enough to know that as long as there is a universe, I am a part of it.
There are some thoughts. Lots of hands up already.
Hello there, yes.
Perfect. Thoughts, I grew up Catholic.
Uh-huh.
I have never heard anybody be able to express, as you did, why the transition for me was not as difficult as it turned out to be. Because of the common values that you just kind of said, that even a sometimes not so inviting
organization as a Catholic Church can be, it is full of very similar ideals. And I think, I wonder if some of the advantage of, say, the humanistic organizations have, that they are so young still. You know, I wonder the preceders to the Catholic, who eventually became the Catholic Church, in the first or second century, when it obviously was on the outskirts. We're much more closer to who we are or think of ourselves nowadays here. And that since then it obviously has turned into something different, and that this is maybe also a warning to us to not let us become calcified or, you know, organized and fighting for power, among other things.
Thank you. You know, one of the things that I did when I knew that I could no longer be a practicing Catholic, but wanted to still learn more about Catholicism and appreciate it, was to look at the early church, as you mentioned. And, you know, the early church had a lot of women, and women were equal to the men in the early church. And so I really, when I was leader at the New York Society, I taught a class called Humanist Interpretation of the Bible. And part of it was I looked at the Gnostic Gospels, and I love the Gnostic Gospels. Gospel of Mary Magdalene, you know, Elaine Pagels does a lot, the Gospel of Thomas that helped her. And so looking at the early church and why were they banned? Because once you establish yourself as a patriarchy, and once you establish that only men can become priests, then you have to lock up a lot of that. So a lot of that was put behind locked doors. And going back and looking at that and reading that was helpful for me. I couldn't remain a Catholic, but it was helpful to know that that history was there.
I was really struck by your words about how you don't want to judge somebody who's taking comfort from what they feel is loving God, or somebody who's lost a loved one and feels that they're going to reunite. And I guess I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about what that's like for you in different situations, and what it's like for the people on the other side, because I often that's my default, but I don't know if it's been as generous. I feel like a little bit of me is shutting down sometimes, and sometimes with close friends I don't even think of it. I just think, yes, this is their beliefs, but on other times it feels a little scary. I actually feel a little shaky inside, because I can tell we're approaching something where you can't believe one of what each of us believes without judging the other. And so I'm just interested in that area, and that was very meaningful for me to hear you talk about that.
I think it's intentional, and it's a practice that I grew into, that I didn't always have it, and I will still have that initial feeling or that initial thought, you know, this is bullshit. I have a visceral reaction when I hear people say passed away or passed over. I just have a visceral, and I'll say, you mean someone died. So I'll have the thought, I'll have the feeling, and then I intentionally shift that before I say something. A lot of that comes out of training as a chaplain. Training as an ethical culture clergy leader, training as a university chaplain, because when you're sitting across from someone in a pastoral counseling session, you're thinking a lot of, you got monkey brain, you're thinking a lot of things, you're feeling a lot of things, but you're called to be present in a relationship with someone. So I think a lot of it comes out of that professional training that I then becomes an intentional practice when I'm just with ordinary people. So yeah, and I think it is that, you know, taking a beat, you know, just take a beat, you go, I'm thinking this, I'm feeling this. What does this person need from me? And maybe this person needs silence. Certainly that person doesn't need judgment.
And do you feel that that's given to you also, that somebody who's got other beliefs is gonna take a beat and you're like, yep, she doesn't believe in God, but.
Not as often.
Or what's.
Yeah.
Or you feel sometimes that it's not.
Yeah.
A little bit extra.
Well, you know, it's funny. I live in a bubble. I mean, I live in a humanist bubble for the most part. So I don't have that confrontation. When I most often have that confrontation is when I go back to my hometown with my cousins. I'm with, you know, people who grew up differently, or when I look at Facebook and I see some of my high school friends posting stuff, and I go, oh, you know. So but for the most part, I live in a very comfortable humanist bubble where I'm not confronted with that. So when I have to sort of gird myself, you know, when I'm in other environments, other settings, I again, because I'm retired and I'm not on campuses anymore, I would get that more at Columbia and NYU with my colleagues. Although if you're a university chaplain, you're pretty open to everything. But even there would be a few fairly right-wing, you know, mostly Christians, who would be very rigid and not accepting of me. So that would be one environment, but mostly I'm in a bubble. But thanks for your question.
Thank you for a very articulate talk. A couple of thoughts came up for me. One, we had one of the ethical culture leaders came and spoke here a number of years ago, and he's deceased now. I think he was in Philadelphia.
Richard Myron.
Yes, and he came and spoke specifically about there's a lot of us out there that have a lot in common with us, and we should be reaching out to them. And I'm like, yeah, well, maybe not. But I grew up Jewish. I became an ethical culturalist. I was married to a Catholic. There's the utter hypocrisy. I apologize that as you're reading these core values of Catholicism is so striking and so astonishing. It almost seems, though, from what you're saying, that it's almost like there's a faction of Catholics that should split off and become a different party. You know what I mean? Because they carry a lot of baggage, and I sound intolerant, but I just can't countenance the bullshit.
Yeah. Well, there has been a lot of splitting. I mean, certainly not just the historical Reformation, but the diocese that I grew up in, Rochester, was actually very liberal. And as I said, my uncle had the first altar girls. And there was a splinter church right in the city of Rochester, the diocese, that illegally ordained women. So there is a lot of that goes on. And maybe we don't hear about it as much, but it does go on. And I remember Bishop Bill Casey in Rochester would say, "Shh, okay, but just be quiet about it."
Why do you want to stay a part of a body that is so contrary?
Yeah.
You know, I'm sorry.
And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. A lot of it has to do with family. And look, if you, in my hometown, fewer than 4,000 people. If you don't belong to a church, you pretty much can't earn a living. You know, I mean, can you sell a used car to somebody if they don't see you in church on Sunday? Can you sell insurance? I mean, there are a lot of places in this country, in this state, whatever, that you can't really make a living if you don't at least pay lip service to, you know, to having some sort of a belief or a faith. I think that's just a reality. I think that's just a fact of life. And so I think people make compromises. And also my son was a religion major at the University of Rochester. And he said what was fascinating to him was that what he was learning about religion and what was maybe written on paper or the theology, very different from the religion practiced in the pews.
Yeah.
So in a Catholic church, in a parish, you can have a very warm, loving feeling, and you're not, you don't, how many Catholics sitting in the pews today believe when they go up to get that wafer, that that's literally the body of Christ? They don't believe it, but that's the teaching.
And I guess that's what, yeah. We'll
People-
talk about-
people
talk
make-
about it.
People make compromises to live their lives. Yeah.
The talk made me think of a few things and Katrina's question also. The idea of with Katrina's question made me think of this difference between atheism and non-theism, right? This idea of and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, because I'm just learning about it right now. This idea of non-theism of like, well, it's just not a question that as an organization, humanist societies like ethical culture, etc., would need to answer, because it's neither here nor there, and that, okay, you could believe in a God or not. It's not debatable whether one exists or not. It's not a question, right? We're here for the human culture. But the other point that you made me think of was, I think at their core foundation, all the big religions are humanists at their foundation, right? This idea of like, how do we exist as humans, right, for each other in this world? But again, humans get in their own way, right? Because part of being a human is having both good and bad, right? Wanting, needing to struggle with this egoistic desire for power versus not, right, or whatever. And so, yeah, how do people stay in these organizations that as they evolve, they're evolving by human beings who are very fallible, who are very flawed, and very right, and so they turn into these things. And Susan's question makes me think of like the turn of our country right now, right, where it might go. Do we leave it, or do we stand and fight for it? And I wonder if some of the people who stay in these organizations and don't leave, right, even though they have contradictory internal beliefs, are like, well, do we leave it, or do we fight to make it more what we believe in? I don't know.
That's a good analogy.
I don't know if you want to say anything, Glenn, but my husband, and the point that you just made is one that Glenn often makes.
I mean, there are humanists and fundamentalists in every religion. And my shorthand definition is fundamentalists believe the rules are more important than the people. And humanists believe the people are more important than the rules. And my favorite story about that is a young man in New Jersey, a family goes to the local priest and said, my kid is gluten intolerant. Can we use a rice wafer for communion? And the local priest said, no, it has to be a wheat wafer. And then they go to the next parish and the guy says, of course you can have a rice wafer. Being in communion with the congregation is more important.
And that reminds me of a story of my uncle, Father Tom. So he had parishes in the Rochester diocese, and there was, as you can imagine, many families in these parishes had large numbers of children. And so this one, he told me the story about, of course, he didn't tell me this story until I was in college. You don't tell a child this story. But anyway, mother comes to him and says, Father, I don't know what to do. I have 6 children. And she was in her 30s. I have 6 children. Rhythm is not working for us. And so Father Tom said, go on the pill. But there's an encyclical. Screw the encyclical. You've done enough for God. And so how it's lived is different than what's in an encyclical. And I always remember that story about him because it just speaks to his, to his humanity and to his love and seeing these women who look 10, 20 years older than they are and run ragged. And he said, go on the pill, just do it.
You drag me into this. Just don't make me do karaoke. You mentioned one of the precepts or the tenets of being humility in the Catholic Church. So do you think that
No, it's actually the AHA.
humility? Okay, so. But do you think that that is encompasses the issue of certainty versus doubt? As a means of, you know, if I'm certain that I'm right, I'm not gonna be very humble. If I have some doubt, maybe the other person's right, but.
Glenn and I watched Conclave last night. Seeing Conclave. I was, in fact, on the ride up here, I was Googling homily because I wanted to get, he does Ray Fiennes as the cardinal, before convening the conclave. He gives a homily, and in that homily, he says, the worst sin is certainty. And then he goes on to talk about certainty and doubt, and he says, give me a pope who has doubts. And that was very different from the way that I was raised. You were expected to believe the Baltimore Catechism, you believed it, and you were given the gift of faith to accept the mysteries that couldn't be explained.
Certainty is the enemy of
Unity.
Of unity, and doubt is necessary for tolerance.
Yeah, necessary for faith. Anyway, I recommend Conclave, if
Just
only
that
for
one
that,
scene.
if only for that homily. I don't know.
Personal part. I can just, preface it by saying, I was not baptized when I was a child, and I lived in Italy for about a year and a half of the United States, and went to a Catholic crusade, French crusade, and I was taken through catechism class. I probably should not have been included in the class because I wasn't Catholic, but I remember I have a vivid memory of having the priest present a image of a baby in total darkness and saying that this is what would happen to children who were not baptized. So that led to about 5 years of fear of damnation.
Yes.
So my mother eventually got me baptized at Lutheran when we went to Norway. In addition, so and also just adding on to that, that just I felt great. But it made a very, very strong impression on me. And I taught in Ireland a number of years. And I did a lot of counseling in Ireland. And I can't tell you, I'm sure you know, being Irish, having an Irish Catholic background, the number of people who had devastating stories related to the church. So my question to you, you know, I had difficulty overcoming what I was told, and that was just one experience. And then I've talked to many people who obviously had great suffering in their lives because of their experience of the church in Ireland. And you described an experience which was both very loving, but you were also told this is the truth, and you didn't have to believe it. So I'd just like to know, I know that there was a lot of love around you, but it takes a certain quality, a certain attitude to be able to say, even though mommy says that this is the law and that you have to believe that, or the priest says it, or whatever, you were able to transcend that in a way that, you know, left you, sounds like it left you not only unharmed, but also open to the church. So I'd just like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I think it's luck. I bet, because I know I have friends that who were raised Catholic who were traumatized by it. I was not traumatized, but I think part of it was luck. It was a lovely parish. I love the priest. Well, let me backtrack a little bit. The baptism is so interesting because if you're not baptized, unbaptized souls are in limbo, not in hell. So of course we imagined all these babies who were not baptized in limbo. I mean, the imagery that you have it's ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
But the baptism, it is to wash away original sin, getting back to the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. She did not have original sin, but original sin is an invention. It's nonsense that was invented by a church that had to write down this stuff. And so it's the baptism is to wash away the original sin. What's the original sin? Sex. I mean, conception, how one is conceived by a physical sexual act. I mean, it's absurd, but that's what it's kind of based on, that original sin. So back to today being the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. But yeah, I mean, it really depends upon the community. And that's why, you know, the emphasis on community. The community of that parish was healthy. And if it wasn't, if it had unhealthy aspects, I was unaware of it. I'm sure it did have unhealthy aspects of which I was totally oblivious. But it was a healthy environment for me. But I know horror stories of people who were raised differently, and whose, you know, the priests. Yeah, I don't need to get into the details of it. So part of it, I think, is just dumb luck, you know, that I was fortunate enough to be born at a time and in a place and to go through these things. I can show you some of the harm that it does, though, because we were taught that we were special. And one of the things about the Vatican II and Ecumenical Council is Pope John the 23rd said, you know what, we are all Christians in different denominations, and kind of loosened that up a bit. But before that, Catholics were the only ones that were going to go to heaven. I mean, that was it. It was exclusive. And some of the harm, in third grade, I had a friend, Sherry Blankenberg, who was Protestant. And one day I said to her, "You're a very nice girl, Sherry, and I'm glad that we're friends, but I'm very sad that you'll never go to heaven." She'll never go to heaven because she's Protestant. And she wept. I made that little girl cry. And I said, it's not up to me. But that's the kind of harm that exclusivity does. And so to now say, as a social teaching, inclusivity, it's a big change. But part of it is cultural, because part of it's in theology, but part of it is also cultural.
I just want to say that I connected very much with you. I grew up in Chile, went to Catholic school for my elementary school, high school, Catholic university, and I had a very magical, mystical, and healthy relationship with my community and the church that I went to, and it was all about service. So I think because of at the time that I was born and the way how the church operated there, these were nuns coming from Germany who were going through difficult times in their country and came to serve and looked at the vulnerable, which was the poor people, and there were lines of people going there to get meals and foods every Sunday. So the experience that I had from it was always service, where I was part of a youth group, very healthy too, and it was about going out into the country areas and bring toys, and it wasn't much about what I learned when I came to the United States, which it was more about that we are God's children, the chosen people. So then I would have Aaron say, "So what about me?" And so I started seeing, and then I went to college, of course, and I learned about the 3 M's of Catholicism. But there is still that connection with the community that I have here in Austin with St. Anne's, which most of the parish members are from South America, and they're kind of the people that they have that one-on-one relationship with me, and that I know that as I did before, don't know anything else but just what we were taught, and it's more about the things that you have to do all the time, the kneeling, the praying, the going to get the Eucharistic, and it's not about, we don't get that extra that you just presented here, like the 10 Commandments are like something totally different with the values or the ethics. Nobody's being taught that unless you went to a different level of learning. So it's very much in a bubble, like you said. So, and that is why it's so hard to leave. So instead of saying, okay, I'm gonna leave, you try to fix it, because now you are adding all the things, all the values and ethics that perhaps you consider that they are part of the church. And then when you read all the encyclics of the Juan Paul II, like he was very much for the people and the poor, and that's the time when I was born. So I feel in a way that I got the best that I could have gotten out of it. And it's exactly what you said. There is so much commonality between Catholicism and ethical society.
And I know it's getting, the kids are getting antsy, so I'm not wind up. But you mentioned nuns, and I just want to say something in support of nuns. When I was growing up, I did not like nuns. Nuns were the disciplinarians. And of course, they dressed in the habits and everything, and they were the disciplinarians we did not like, especially Sister Teresa Gerard, did not like her. But my friend Anne Alderman was a St. Joseph nun, and other nuns who stayed, because many of them left, but the ones who stayed, they are on the social justice ramparts of Catholicism. They're the nuns on the bus. They're the ones who are in the prisons. They're the ones who are reproductive justice. And the nuns are, I mean, not all of them, obviously, but the ones that I know and am familiar with are very liberal. And the male priests are conservative. And over the years, I've heard stories from my friend that she would come into a parish and there would be these young male priests, very conservative, very not connected to people. And so she would be there, well-educated, with a lot of experience, Catholic through and through, but far more liberal. And so my attitude and impression of nuns changed a lot. They were not the disciplinarian Sister Teresa Gerard, but the social justice warriors, like my friend, and who hold it together. And whether it's the women in the early church who were holding it together, they're still holding it together. And they're still not able to do the magic of the transubstantiation, but they're the ones who are holding it together. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have any music now?
Oh,
We do. And then I'll go a brief closing word.
Well, how many of you know the song This Little Light of Mine? I know. Okay.
Did you go to kindergarten?
Pardon?
Did you go to kindergarten?
That's not where I learned it, but that's interesting to know.
Hang on just a second and I'll show it to everybody in the world.
So it has, actually the talk earlier today, having to keep faith and how to keep calm and how to stay even in these times of stress. So this is a song that I turn to for that, because it's all about enhancing your own inner sense, whether it's loving kindness or service or whatever it is that you really believe in that carries you on.
What's
So
that?
in this song, it's you all know the song? Yes. Okay. So you repeat it's like that's too high? So it comes in two parts, so you sing the first verse and the second verse and the third verse, and then we break off. Are you familiar with the glory, glory?
No.
Okay, so if we sing the first three verses, the first two verses, then while can you scroll down a little bit? Yeah, okay, so while we sing the third verse, part of us break off and sing glory, glory, hallelujah, since I laid my burden down. Glory, glory, hallelujah, since I laid my burden down. Can those of you on this side of this side, remember that?
Yeah.
Okay, so then while the other people are singing everywhere I go to go, I'm gonna let it shine, you're singing glory, glory, hallelujah.
And this side again goes to all the same, the original sound all around the world, while this side goes to I feel better, so much better.
So this side is always doing the red.
You're doing the red.
Okay.
Which is the core.
Yeah.
All come back together.
Yeah, also.
It's all right, don't worry about it.
Is there a lot of mine? Is there a lot Glory, glory, okay. 1, 2, 3. Glory.
That was a great song to get people to contact you, Jeff Morales, to talk about
Yeah.
finding the light. I want to conclude with a short poem by Philip Appelman. Poet I believe I introduced Anne to way back some time ago. But I have to begin with some autobiographical material that Mr. Appelman shares with us. And I will say that some years ago, I did some detective work so I could speak with the poet, Philip Appelman. I opened the New York telephone directory. And speaking of modesty or humility, although he was already a well-known poet, he was listed in the New York telephone directory, which then you could turn the pages of. Had a lovely conversation with him. He would have loved to have come to speak here with us, but his age, which was in the 90s then, and his physical condition made it difficult to travel. But he knew the Ethical Society and he wished us all the very best. He wrote, I was conceived, this is partly about religious attitudes. I was conceived in the same month that John Thomas Scopes was arrested and indicted by a grand jury for the crime of teaching evolution to the school children of Dayton, Tennessee. And that in due course, I was born in the same month that the legislature of the state of Mississippi duplicated the Tennessee anti-evolution law. My memories of those events is imperfect, as I was just born. But I conjure up the temper of the times from the historical fact that in the year of my birth, the famous evangelist Amy Semple McPherson concocting an alibi for the extended rendezvous with her lover, claimed to have been kidnapped by gamblers, dope peddlers, and evolutionists. And from the establishment, a year after my birth, of the American Anti-Evolution Association, an organization open to all citizens, except Negroes, atheists, infidels, agnostics, evolutionists, and habitual drunkards. That was the attitude toward perhaps some of us if we'd been alive then. Appleman became an evolutionist. He's also the editor of the Norton Anthology Critical Anthology of Charles Darwin. He's an expert on Darwin. He was an expert on Darwinism. And he wrote some wonderful poems, some of which are beautiful and tender, some of which express his antagonism to the evangelical Christianity in which he was brought up. This one combines a little bit of his sense of humor and his anger both, and it's very short. O karma, dharma, pudding and pie, give me a break before I die. Grant me wisdom, will, and wit, purity, probity, pluck, and grit. Trustworthy, loyal, helpful, kind, give me great abs and a steel-trap mind. But forgive, ye gods, some humble advice. These little blessings would be nice, to beget an earthly paradise. Colon, make the bad people good, and the good people nice. And before our world goes over the brink, teach the believers how to think. In terms of the thoughts that we can think, as some of you know, among my favorite people in the Clergy Association of the Greater Ossining World are Dominican and Maryknoll nuns. One of whom said to me as we were leaving some event, arm in arm, we believe different things, Bob, but we care about the same things. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Anne.